I'm going to share my screen for just a moment. So welcome to the Toxic Masculinity session. Our speaker is Alejandro Prince. Alejandro was raised in St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. He currently lives in Richmond, Virginia, educating school personnel and communities on creating equitable practices for various social identities. His research interests center on moral philosophy, racial justice, and gender and sexuality. As a violence preventionist, Alejandro is especially interested in the capacity men have to develop healthy self-images in peaceful communities. Now, toxic masculinity is a term that has gained traction over the last few years. And Alejandro is here to talk to us and to discuss with us the harmful consequences of toxic masculinity and the steps society can take to foster healthy masculinity. A little more background, Alejandro serves as the Educational Programs Coordinator for the Virginia Center for Inclusive Communities, and he also serves on the Board of Directors of the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance. So Alejandro, welcome, and let's get started.
Great, thanks for having me.
You are so welcome. So what is toxic masculinity and how does it differ from healthy masculinity?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Robert. I think that toxic masculinity, it has its roots. I believe the term was first coined in the 80s and 90s, and it's voiced in a lot of different circles, everyday communication, in academic circles, and depending on the person, of course, we're going to get different definitions. So what I'll do is I'll offer how I define toxic masculinity. I'll share my screen so it's a little bit more easy to digest for folks. Folks able to see that?
Yes.
Great. So I understand toxic masculinity as the social construction of masculine identity that confines men to narratives of domination and callousness. Of course, there's a lot to be said even within that short sentence. This narrative affects the way we view ourselves as individuals, the way we view one another interpersonally, the way we understand the role of institutions within society, and the way that we understand the nature of geopolitics. These last few things, focusing on institutions and geopolitical spaces, I think is really important to emphasize, because oftentimes in this conversation about masculinity, we're only thinking about identity. All right, we're only thinking about the way that someone might harm another individual, and the ways that there's certain social norms that uphold that type of behavior. I also think it's important to think about how our politics, how the ways that societies, countries, communities within them function and have certain norms, unexamined and examined, that uphold this type of behavior. So I think there's a number of things that we could attribute to toxic masculinity. I'll just name a few of them. This idea that we should be logical over having emotion, as though the two are somehow separate, right? That you should be only up here and never here. Right. The idea that aggression needs to be an inherent part of who you are, that your capacity for violence must somehow be greater than the next person's, right? Especially when you're talking about the capacity to dominate other men. And, I'll also add that this idea of aggression is oftentimes overrepresented and confused as strength. Toxic masculinity also, is upheld by this concept of hypersexuality, that you need to be extremely sexually active in a heterosexual sense way more often than you are not, right? More on that later. Toxic masculinity is also upholds some sort of anti-femininity, right? That somehow having some sort of feminine qualities makes you lesser than, makes you weak, inferior. There's all sorts of sexist and homophobic slurs that are associated with it that folks learn from very young ages, unfortunately. And finally, I'll say that toxic masculinity is anti-feminist, right? So against all of those norms of women and femmes having expressions in society that are equal to men's. where individuality of men who want to be feminists as well is also downplayed. So those are just a few things about toxic masculinity. We could go on for hours about this, as I'm sure most of you in the audience could as well. I'll also share some ideas I have about healthy masculinity. I understand healthy masculinity as constructed around ideals of self-awareness, intimacy with self and others, nurturing practices, compassion, the acceptance of things beyond our control, and the capacity to create peace. I would like to summarize this whole thing with some colloquial language that we use. So men can be gentle, right? And I'm not talking about the phrase being a gentleman, which is also like a very soft, patriarchal, sexist notion. But this idea that we could be gentle shouldn't be confused with the ideas that men are somehow soft if you're gentle, right? That we can hold these ideas of softness and gentleness without connoting some sort of inferiority to your inherent masculinity. I think healthy masculinity also embraces positive, healthy human traits as just those, that these are human traits, right? So I kind of want to blur this line between thinking that as humans, we inherently have masculine or feminine traits and they can't somehow coexist in male, female, or intersex bodies. These things can indeed coexist. And oftentimes when we're talking about healthy traits for masculinity, we're talking about healthy traits for humans in general, right? So anyone of any gender expression, gender identity can embrace these notions of healthy masculinity, right? And finally, I'll just say that healthy masculinity should recognize the harm that toxic masculinity has done. And there should be a commitment to healing the ways that toxic masculinity continues to impact people of all genders and social identities. And one little caveat here, we're using masculinity in the singular, but I like to say that throughout history, there's been different iterations of the concept of masculinity. There have been different points of it that have been emphasized in some communities, not necessarily in others. And so I like to use the masculinities, the plural, when we're talking about masculinity, especially healthy masculinities. So yeah, that kind of it. That's it right there. I know we have some other questions to get onto, so I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen for this, and I'll share a little bit more later.
So that's fantastic. So you've given us a really nice baseline definition and understanding of toxic masculinity as opposed to healthy masculinity. As it relates to behavior and beliefs, what are some behaviors and beliefs associated with toxic masculinity?
Strong beards over everything else. I'm kidding. Yeah, beards are to be appreciated or not, depending on one's experience, right? But yeah, some behaviors and beliefs that are associated with toxic masculinity. I'll name, first of all, aggression. Sometimes using that interchangeably with violence, but of course recognizing that aggression can be emotional. It could be some form of like mental coercion. Aggression can be translated in various spaces. Another trait of toxic masculinity, I think, is the concept of domination, right? That it's not that the quintessential core of your being is not to live in harmony with other folks, but to dominate, right? Especially non-human species, right? You need to be able to dominate animals. You need to be able to dominate nature. You need to be able to have the engineering capacity, if you will, to make machines and technology do whatever it is you want to do, especially when it serves ideas of hypersexualization, subjugation of women, so on and so forth. And just backing up a step, subjugation of women is also a behavior or belief of toxic masculinity. Homophobia, right? The idea that if you are a man who loves other men, that somehow that makes you lesser than a man who loves women, right? Or is sexually attracted others, to other women. Transphobia, of course, is very related to that. And I'll say, especially as we see year after year, trans women, and especially Black trans women, murdered at astonishing rates. When we talk about persons per capita, that's been very clear about the ways that masculinity and the insecurities that folks have about their masculinity and what it takes to prove it is somehow demonstrated in violence towards trans women. I'll say the romanticization of war is also a belief, behavior associated with toxic masculinity. Pick your movie, right? And though I think there's a relationship to understanding the sacrifice and love for others and other components about being a human that inform those movies, I think at the end of the day, they serve as this type of upholding this heroic ideal that if you are a man, you should always strive to, right? We could go on for days about the romanticization of war for masculine identity. I'll say objectification is, of course, a crucial component of toxicity within masculine expression. Objectifying women and femmes as sexual objects. And what's spoken about less or so, I think, is the way that men objectify themselves, right? That the ways that they express themselves sexually or in life in general is seen in this very detached sense, right? I'm an object to make more money, right? I'm an object to score more goals or make more baskets or be an athlete in some sense. And that's very depersonalized sense of ourselves. And, we mentioned hypersexuality, right? And I think within the toxic conception of sexuality with masculine identity is this, it's weird that it's hypersexual because there's also this sexual detachment from intimacy, right? The point is to beat it up or tear it up, right? See how well you can dominate another person rather than like this be a thing of closeness, this be a thing of strong intimacy. Toxic masculinity, this is kind of similar to the domination thing, but having a strong sense of authority over others, right? To reject femininity in a lot of different ways. To, dominate other species and this is slightly going back to the objectification piece, but I would say also the rejection of sexual assault on boys and men is a strong part of toxic masculinity. Denying that it is a thing, denying that it can happen, denying that it happens actually very often, and denying that it takes some sort of vulnerability to accept when it happens and find pathways to healing. So I'll stop there. I know we could go on and on about different ways that behaviors and beliefs of toxic masculinity show up. Happy to move forward.
I think it's interesting. You mentioned from the beginning that there is this political and geopolitical component to toxic masculinity, and I think we see that on display right now in Eastern Europe. And so with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, certainly the leader of the invading country sort of embraces the toxic masculine paradigm there. So well, moving forward here, let's see. How are those behaviors and beliefs that you just talked about, how are they influenced by socially constructed gender scripts?
Sure. That's a great question. And before I start answering, I think I'll say I am not a scholar's scholar by any stretch of the imagination. I know things, I make an intention to learn more, to educate myself, and to talk to people much wiser and knowledgeable than myself. And I'm not a historian. I would, however, like to take us to certain socio-historical, like cultural contexts for how masculinity and therefore some aspects of femininity have been constructed in gender scripts in the Western world specifically. So I'll share my screen again. This is something I think should be included in most conversations on gender studies in the West. Give me 1 second. Okay, should be able to see that now. So I'll say a lot of the norms that we have established in the Western world are at once personal, but also political. And, though we could trace these ideas much further back in, Babylonian society, we could talk about the Code of Hammurabi. We could talk about different ways that ancient cultures and, ancient religious practices have formed the ways that we think about gender scripts. I want to just look at Eric. So I think some of the stuff that he says, particularly in this book, Politics, that he wrote, will be enlightening in terms of how a lot of our political and therefore personal values have been shaped in the Western world. So in Politics, he has this section where he talks about how households are meant to be a miniature representative of the state, or in Greek, that's polis, right? Which, in today's world, we might translate that as city-state. He believes that in order to produce the highest good in those situations, we need to have households that reflect the ways that states function. And so he says a household should be made up of 3 parts: master and slave, husband and wife, father and children. Right, and I would say notice that he doesn't say mother and children, right? In like the heteronormative, oftentimes, subscribing women to more intentional roles in child rearing than men do, right? It doesn't even mention that. So the idea is that the man is the head of the household, that women who, in his imagination, are inferior to men are supposed to submit to them, and that folks should have slaves because slaves, like animals, are somehow inferior in their capacity to be civilized and to have lives that are dignified and, to look at this quote at the end, useful for political life in both arts of war and peace. So this idea from Aristotle is carried on to his mentee, person he mentored, Alexander the so-called Great. And this idea of the polis for Alexander the Conqueror became the cosmopolis, right? Something that the entire world should follow. Everyone should be Greek. Everyone should just follow the script of your household should be led by a man, and therefore look like the ways that we have our politics in the Greco-Roman world. Could go on and on about this, but I'll say for now that we can see this clearly in the ways that the United States, for example, has formed its politics. All right, we can see this in the ways that slavery, particularly of enslaved Africans residing in the Western world, in the Caribbean, particularly the way that this idea of inferiority was placed upon enslaved folks there. This inferiority of women also goes hand in hand in that. This idea we need to dominate animals, right? This is a script that is translated time and time again. I live here in Virginia, so I'm prone to reference Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, which look very much so like what Aristotle was saying. So this has somehow become like a norm, and this idea that patriarchy and men being leaders of the household should be reflected in society in general. We also see this in different mythologies. We see this in ideas of like heroes and gods and the stories that we tell children. And oftentimes, even though there's a plethora of examples of women who are gods and women who can be heroes, in various different cultures, oftentimes what patriarchal colonialism and masculinity will do is erase these stories in ways that emphasize the relevance of these male heroes and male gods. And so, with that is the ways that political leaders use these ideas of masculinity to make war with each other. The idea that you'll be rewarded somehow with more intimacy from women. I could go on and on about that. I'll say maybe in like a less macro political sense, to go back to the question, some of the beliefs and behaviors that socially construct gender scripts in our society, shaming women for their sexuality while enjoying the fact that I'm a man and I could get however much I want, do however much I want, and I should feel like a champion. I should feel like a hero for that. Whereas women and femmes are demonized, called names, slut shamed for similar behaviors. I'll say deeply tied to toxic masculinity is this inherent insecurity. There's a fear of rejection. And to mask that, we take social norms on jealousy being accepted in order to push power and control on individuals we're in relationship with. And so because we can hide behind, well, she shouldn't be texting anyone else, therefore I can go through her phone, all right, therefore I can stalk her, therefore I can use coercive language and sexual behavior. All right, we hide behind these things rather than actually having healthy relationship norms of discussing what are your insecurities? What are you feeling? What do you get sad about? When are you triggered? Instead of doing those things, there's this, I think, this normalization of unhealthy relationship norms that toxic masculinity just soaks all up. I'll say also, going back to the political thing, there's women have historically been viewed as property, all right, being tied to their husbands economically. If you don't have a husband, you can't have any access to land. For most of our previous decades and centuries, you can't have your own money. If you do, it needs to be given straight to the man. And of course, the laws that go with that legalize the physical abuse of women and legalize sexual violence towards women, which, the first rape crisis center wasn't founded until the 70s. All right, and I meant to say this at the beginning, but a conversation on toxic masculinity is inherently a conversation on violence in many forms. And so forgive me, I meant to give a content warning for that earlier. But here's that for what it's worth. And also finally, the last thing I'll add here is that the social gender role script that we've bought into is that public life is somehow for men and private life is somehow for women, right? Women are supposed to be over the households, see the nurturing of children, and men, as though it were like a better thing, are seen as, like Aristotle said, useful for acts of like war and for peace. So I'll leave it there. Anything you'd like for me to expand on that, I'm happy to. You're on mute, Robert.
I couldn't help but think after discussion on Aristotle and the ideals that he put forth in regard to the household as sort of a model or a smaller model or microcosm of the larger state. When you think about the founding of the United States and backing up into the colonial period and the various colonies that were established here in North America, John Winthrop and the Puritans embraced the concept of the family as the little commonwealth, with the man as head of household and everyone else in the household, from the wife to the children to servants or slaves, as the dependent classes. And so those things became ingrained in the development of early societies here, and certainly followed into the development of the political entity which became the United States. And you mentioned property. Owning property was equated to political rights, and only men could own property. And so women and people of color and people who were considered slave or not free were denied those basic political rights and thus civil rights. And so it's ingrained in our institutions, going back to what you earlier said. And so we're having to deconstruct this with this type of education in our culture here. Another question for you, what are some positive aspects of masculinity and masculine culture? And obviously we'd be referencing more the healthy masculinity that you defined for us earlier.
Yeah, thank you. To reiterate something I kind of touched on earlier, I think it's important to acknowledge that even these positive aspects of masculinity, masculine culture, can be demonstrated in folks of all genders. All right, and so when we're having a conversation about positive masculinity, I think these are things that humans of all identities can share. A couple of them that I think are really important, especially for today's world, is that concept of bravery or courage. It takes bravery to, as a masculine identifying individual, be gentle. It takes bravery and courage to deal with emotions. All right. Back when I used to teach classes on healthy relationships with youth, one thing they would bring up always is that, boys shouldn't cry, right? You shouldn't be out there in public crying. It makes you look weak. I was like, well, let's touch on that a little bit. Is it weak to be able to acknowledge your emotions and feel them and process them? Or is it weak to ignore them and therefore have some sort of instability? Going back to bravery and courage, it takes courage to be able to address misogyny, cis heterosexism and homophobia, rape culture. These are things that require action, right? It takes a lot of courage and bravery in order to step into that, both individually and when you're talking to your peers. I think this idea of leadership kind of connected to bravery and courage, although you shouldn't limit it there. Leadership is also a great quality, I think, that people really embrace in a healthy way. A healthy and a humble way, right? I think real leadership has to be humble in some capacity. There are a lot of positive traits, I think, that could be attributed to this idea of masculinity and therefore like healthy humanity. And I think the last thing I'll add is different cultures throughout history have had different ways of understanding what it means to be a masculine being. Right now I'm thinking of a book, and I see fatherhood mentioned into the chat. Yeah, being a great parent, it's definitely a healthy quality. And I'll get to some comments in the chat later during Q&A, but this idea of going back to ideas of different masculinities in different cultures, sometimes respecting seniority, I think, is a common thing we saw in a lot of cultures that have been colonized by the West. And with our ageist, ableist practices today, make it more difficult to respect seniority in the ways that have been done before. So one book I'll recommend on thinking of different aspects of masculinity is When Jesus Came, the Corn Mothers Went Away, Marriage, Sexuality, and Power in New Mexico, 1500 to 1846. Talks about Pueblo indigenous culture in New Mexico specifically before colonialism really took its roots. So that's one idea that I wish I had time to give you a nice summary here, but you'll see a lot of different aspects of what it means to be masculine and for nurturing qualities to be inherent within that as well.
And you might want to put the title of that book in the chat before our sessions over there.
Sure.
I do have, I've got a couple more questions here. So how does toxic masculinity directly affect the LGBTQ plus community?
Great question. And in some ways, it deserves a session of its own. I'll say here, a few things. And I think this kind of ties in other ideas presented earlier about romanticization of war and politics. But for us to think that it is more natural for men to make war with each other than to make love to each other, I think is just devastating. I would often talk to students, across the sexuality spectrum, most of them males. I would ask them, like, when have you told one of your guy friends that you love them recently? And most of them be like, I might say it, but I might add the no homo after it, right? Very common homophobic thing folks do. I was like, you get in relationships with girls, you're in high school, 3 weeks, 3 months later, you're saying I love you to them. You've known guys since the second grade, talk to each other almost every day. Here you are in 10th grade now, but you never once told him you love him. So, affects lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans folks in a lot of harmful ways, a lot of them violent when it comes to emotional and physical things. And it affects those persons that are homophobic to such an extent that they won't even acknowledge that love they have for someone of the same gender. I think this rejection of gender diversity within toxic masculinity is very impactful and hurtful towards LGBTQ folks. When you reject that gender diversity, there's also this hostility towards women, towards femmes, trans folks. Anytime there's someone who deviates from this, man box that we've encompassed men within, there's some sort of hostility there. We mentioned earlier the ways that trans women are disproportionately affected by that type of toxic masculinity. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think sexual violence impacts LGBTQ folks much in higher rates than it does, straight identifying folks. And I think perhaps among the highest rates of sexual assault there are for bisexual women, particularly when they're encountered with men who want to turn them, right? It's like, oh, you just like women because you never really had it like this before. And therefore there's this coercion, there's unwillingness to care about her consent. There's overall, because toxic masculinity is constructed around these ideals of strength, aggression, and rejection of anything in society that we connote as softness, there's all sort of misinterpretations of what it means to be gay, bisexual, lesbian in society. So, again, a lot more we could say there, but I think those are some of the fundamentals.
So I have one more question, and then I'd like to turn our attention to some of the comments here in the chat feature and open it up to questions. And that is, what steps can society take to deconstruct toxic masculinity and begin to change those behaviors?
Yeah, great question. The first thing I want to name is realize the contradiction of it, that some of the most masculine, quote unquote, men, I'm thinking of Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay. He talked all the time about how pretty he is. You know what I'm saying? Float like a butterfly. Not exactly the most masculine image that we've stereotypically thought of, right? So like a butterfly sting like a bee. He's talking about one of his opponents, and what did he say? Oh, he's too ugly. We can't have someone that ugly as a world champ. We need a pretty world champ like me. Right. So acknowledging the contradiction between this idea that you need to be this hyper masculine, toxic figure, and there's actually not an inconsistency there between whatever form of masculinity you choose to identify and whatever feminine qualities that you want to embody as well. I'll also mention the Migos, right? Migos, one of the popular hip hop groups right now. They wear blouses and stuff all the time, right? But because there are things in their music that are sexist and misogynistic and homophobic, that's not scrutinized in a way that we might other folks. So that's one thing. Realize the contradiction. Reject patriarchy. Acknowledging the ways that patriarchy is not just hurtful towards women, femmes, LGBTQ folks, but that patriarchy is hurtful towards cisgender men as well. That killing of emotions that you do with yourself to reject anything that might be confused as weakness, that has a severe impact on how you're able to express yourself as a human and have a decent quality of life. I'd say next, look at what patriarchy and toxic masculinity have done to the planet. There's this great book, what's it called? Gender and Climate Change. Don't remember the name of the scholars that wrote it, but that I'm also thinking of the book Ecofeminism, and of course ecofeminism is a theory in general. There's a lot that we can attribute, a lot about climate disaster, about the ways that the world can't sustain life in the same ways that it used to, and warming of the climate, that we can attribute to behaviors that over-militarize countries that don't see nurturing the land, or rather extracting from the land is the normal thing. A lot of these are tied to concepts of masculinity and dominance over nature and other species that I think is very harmful. And, in the United States, we could think about the Dawes Act, for example, when land from indigenous folks was split up and divided in this very private property, man of the household, Aristotelian type thought, where women are seen as property, and you get more tax credits and acres per person in your household. That breaks up complex family structures. That is, compulsorily monogamous. So many things we can say about that in toxic masculinity and patriarchy. And finally, I would like to say that we should encourage nuance and intersectionality as a way of deconstructing toxic masculinity. Not all men are the same. Men have different histories in society. People of all genders have complex identities. We are never just one thing as a person. You're never just gendered. There's cultural, ethnic experiences that we have. There are experiences we have socioeconomically, right? One example I'll give here in the ways that we need to add some nuance to our conversation on concepts of masculinity is enslaved persons in the United States. Did they have genders? Right? I'm asking kind of rhetorically, but if in this period of time, femininity is constructed as being able to be delicate and pretty, and bear a certain amount of children, and have this level of softness, enslaved women weren't able to have that. They were just seen as, you need to be here to reproduce more slaves, right? You need to work just as hard as the men. And then men, if you take away this idea that you can protect the women in your lives, right? That the masters can do whatever they want, right? There's ways that these gender scripts that have informed society don't translate across folks' experiences. So I think just deconstructing that all of it is constructed in the first place,
right?
And there's no way our experiences can be fully encompassed within toxic masculinity, is a huge component. And of course, last thing I'll say, education, right? Have comprehensive sex education in schools. Give folks the tools they need to understand themselves, express themselves, have healthy relationships with each other. That should be a part of every school curriculum in some capacity. And I think, we'll be in much better shape.
Alejandro, this has been wonderful here. There are a couple of comments in our chat session. Sherry Wand says that she moved back to Lexington in 2006, having lived many years in Chicago. She said, I noticed that I'm often talked over and interrupted often in male majority conversations. This was not the case while living in Chicago. Do you see more toxic masculinity in some areas than others?
Yeah, great question. My life experience is limited. I'll give that disclaimer. I've only been so many places. But I'll say that the politics of the region, yeah, I'm not going to reduce that either to a red state versus blue state type thing. But the norms around what it means to be in leadership in gender, who is limited to just being for lack of better language, a house servant, right? And therefore it shouldn't be speaking as much. Those ideas do heavily influence how people treat each other based on the region that they're in. I'll say that yes, there is more toxic masculinity. At bare minimum, there is more toxic masculinity in some areas than others. One example I'm thinking of, after my undergrad, I spent a little bit of time in Thailand, year and a half. And I was a little bit younger at that point. I was like really physically fit. I thought I was looking nice, right? And so I was expecting the women to look at me a certain way and really enjoy like what type of physique I had. I had another guy friend, much smaller, right? Less hair on his face. Not like the stereotypical big, strong man, machismo idea that we have, right? They were looking at him a whole lot more than me. And I was like, okay, that's cool. I ain't gonna hate on him, right? But I noticed this might not directly translate to toxic masculinity as some of the other stuff we're talking about, but it's a different standard of what it means to be attracted to men. And it's something that, had I never been there, I might not have thought about in the same way. I hope that's a little bit helpful. But yeah, at bare minimum, I think toxic masculinity does show up in different regions based on politics more than others.
I would say it would be easy to make the assumption, and I'm sure it's not this simple, but if you're in a particular part of a state or community or society where the population is more heterogeneous, where it's more multicultural, more pluralistic in terms of ideologies and values, religion, that you likely have less of a toxic masculine bent to the culture. So, oh, that's great. Now I see there's a comment from Roger Pearson. He says men are shamed for having vulnerable feelings such as shame, sadness, and fear. Anger, on the other hand, is seen as manly, so men often channel all vulnerable feelings into anger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, solid point. And Sherry, thank you for your question earlier. And Roger, I think a huge thing connected to this masking that vulnerability and sheer with anger is that anger and aggression somehow is going to serve you better as a man. All right, that if you, and this might depend heavily on what sort of communities you're raised in and how dangerous your environment might be. But if you show any element of not being competent, not even like being cocky, if you're not that to a certain extent, that could put you in danger. So I think it's important to include in that how environment shapes this need to channel everything into aggression, into anger, rather than actually giving yourself the space to feel that those feelings and actually process them in ways that are healthy.
Cindy Baker has she made the comment here that that she's lived both in the North and South, way South, as she said, and that she's been talked over in many conversations. So she's experienced, had some of those same experiences there that Sherry talked about. Do we have any other questions from our audience?
And while folks were typing those in or unmuting and asking them, I'll say to Cindy's last point, yeah, mansplaining is a thing everywhere, and at least in the United States. And talking over women is something I've seen in lots of different spaces. I've been on the South, I've been in the West, the Caribbean.
So I need to tell me what you want to do, because we also want to go with Sam to drop some of the boxes.
But I did receive it.
Looks like we may have somebody who needs to mute there.
See update address.
I think maybe we have someone who needs to mute.
I think we're good now.
Okay, great. All right. Are there any other closing questions or comments for Alejandro? Well, I want to thank you for an absolutely wonderful conversation, and for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, for offering solutions to this ongoing cultural issue and problem. We hope that you'll come back next year when we host our third conference. And we really appreciate everything that you've shared here today, Alejandro.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. And I do see we have a comment in the chat and a hand raise. Definitely
Yes.
happy to take up space for that as well.
Let's please do that. Yes.
Yeah, Roger, to your comment, I've noticed patriarchal leadership styles used by both men and women in leadership. Any comments? Yeah, great point. I think I hinted at this earlier, but toxic masculinity, like patriarchal norms, is something that, because these are belief systems about how to behave, is something that someone of any gender identity can express. All right, and I'll say particularly for women, whereas we might expect less to see patriarchy in women's bodies expressed, because there's oftentimes male-dominated spaces. There might be the pressure to perform in the same ways. All right, and there's so much we can say about how women's empowerment, because it exists in the patriarchal world as it is today, is oftentimes filtered through those same norms, right? Therefore, you got to show up this way in order to be respected. There's this book called Covering by Kenji Yoshino that talks about how people cover parts of their identities in order to fit into the mainstream. All right, and in the book he gives an example of Margaret Thatcher, which I personally would use a different example, but he talks about how Margaret Thatcher, she's the first woman prime minister of the UK. He said she would oftentimes go to a voice coach to make her voice sound deeper so that she could fit into these male-dominated spaces. So yeah, that's the only comment I had on that. And I think a hand was raised. Otherwise, thanks everyone for the comments.
Did we have another hand raised?
Mr. Hinkle, that was me. I wanted to tell you there was a question in the chat.
Okay, great. Did we get to that question?
Yes, you did.
That was it. Great. Thank you, Cindy. I appreciate that. Okay, folks, we'll wrap it up and hope to see everyone in the closing remarks as Dr. Acapo will be coming by to say hello. Alejandro, thank you again. We really appreciate your time and expertise.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to next time.